You have probably seen the headline flashing across your screens already. Hantavirus outbreak on an international cruise ship. If you are anything like the patients in my clinic, your reaction over the last 48 hours likely fell into one of two extremes: immediate, heart-racing alarm, or cynical, eye-rolling dismissal. Here we go again. Or just another virus the media is blowing out of proportion to keep us glued to our screens. I want to tell you right now, as a physician with over 2 decades of clinical experience tracking infectious diseases and optimizing senior longevity, that both of those reactions are dangerous. They are biological blind spots. Dismissal leaves you completely unprepared, while panic paralyzes the rational mind, preventing you from taking the precise, targeted steps that actually protect your health. My name is Dr. Liam Cooper. Over my 20-plus years in this field, I have watched pathogens behave in ways that textbooks say are impossible. What is happening right now in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on the MV Hondius is a perfect example. We are witnessing a clinical anomaly, a virus traditionally known as a dead-end human infection showing signs of breaking its own evolutionary rules. In this multi-part briefing, we are going to bypass the sensationalized media cycles and dissect the hard science. We will explore how this pathogen behaves inside the human body, analyze its historical precedents, and examine 6 critical clinical dimensions, the medications of knowledge, you need to navigate this emerging landscape. No fearmongering, no false reassurance, just clinical data, objective history, and practical biochemistry. Let's begin by laying the baseline foundation. To understand how to protect yourself from a pathogen like hantavirus, we must first look at its molecular transport vehicle. In the world of infectious diseases, we categorize transmission routes with extreme precision. We have droplet transmission, like influenza, where heavy, moisture-laden particles fall out of the air within a few feet of an infected person. We have true aerosol transmission, like measles, where tiny viral nuclei remain suspended in the air for hours, traveling through ventilation ducts. And then, we have the unique, highly localized aerosolization mechanism of hantavirus. I call this the invisible exposure problem. Unlike most respiratory viruses that rely on a human host coughing or sneezing to propagate, hantavirus is an animal-hosted pathogen. It lives inside specific rodent vectors, primarily the long-tailed pygmy rice rat in South America and the deer mouse in North America. The rodents themselves do not get sick. They are evolutionary vessels. They shed the virus continuously in their saliva, urine, and feces. As these excretions dry out in dark, undisturbed, enclosed spaces, like an old cabin, a dusty attic, a garage closed for the winter, or a ship's lower storage compartments, they break down on a microscopic level. The physical material degrades into ultra-fine, lightweight organic dust. The moment you disturb that space by sweeping, moving old boxes, or shaking out stored blankets, you kick those microscopic, dried viral particles into the air. Here is the terrifying clinical reality. You cannot see these particles. They have no smell, no taste, and cause no immediate sensory irritation in your airway. You breathe them directly into your lungs, walking away, feeling entirely healthy and completely unaware that a biological replication cycle has just been initiated inside your body. To put this invisible danger into historical perspective, we only have to look back at the 1993 Four Corners outbreak in the American Southwest. A young, incredibly fit Navajo athlete collapsed and died of sudden, unexplained respiratory failure. Days later, his fiancée collapsed on the way to his funeral and died of the exact same symptoms. When the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, flooded the region, they discovered that an unusually wet spring had caused a massive explosion in the population of western deer mice. The mice nested in crawl spaces and wood piles, creating thousands of invisible exposure zones. Healthy young people were breathing in these microscopic particles while doing ordinary chores, with zero warning until it was too late. This is a starkly different transmission model than the one we saw with SARS-CoV-2. COVID-19 is highly adapted to human spread, mutating rapidly to bypass our upper respiratory defenses. Hantavirus, conversely, is poorly adapted to humans. Under normal circumstances, when it jumps from a rodent to a human, it hits a biological dead end. The human host gets incredibly sick, but the virus cannot easily shed from that human to infect someone else. But this is exactly why the Andes strain of Hantavirus, currently making headlines on the MV Hondius, has the global scientific community deeply unsettled. It has figured out how to bypass this dead-end rule. In 1996, in El Bolson, Argentina, epidemiologists documented the first-ever cases of human-to-human transmission of Andes virus. A single patient infected 16 others, including healthcare workers who had no contact with rodents. How does this happen? The molecular biology points to a transient window of infectivity. Unlike other hantaviruses, the Andes strain replicates in human respiratory tissues, efficiently enough to be shed in saliva and respiratory droplets, but only during a highly specific phase, the prodromal window. This is the 24 to 48-hour period, when an infected individual first starts running a low-grade fever, but before they look or feel critically ill. This brings us to a crucial clinical distinction that I want you to remember: population-level risk versus individual-level risk. The World Health Organization, WHO, currently assesses the global risk of hantavirus as low, and they are correct. It does not spread efficiently enough through casual contact to trigger a runaway airborne global pandemic like influenza or COVID-19. It requires close, prolonged contact in enclosed, unventilated spaces to transmit between humans. However, if you are the individual occupying that enclosed space, whether it is a dusty rural barn or a cabin on a cruise ship, your individual risk is not low. It is immediate and absolute. This is why understanding the physical mechanics of the invisible exposure problem is your very first and most powerful line of defense. When we look at how hantavirus behaves once it crosses the physical barrier of your respiratory epithelium, we observe a fascinating and brutal biological split. In the field of clinical virology, we classify these manifestations into two distinct, highly destructive clinical syndromes. Which one a patient develops is entirely dictated by the specific viral strain they inhale. 1. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS. This is the New World presentation. Driven by strains like the Sin Nombre virus in North America and the Andes virus in South America, the very strain currently identified in the MV Hondius outbreak. HPS is a master of clinical deception. During the initial incubation phase, which typically lasts anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks and can stretch up to 8 weeks, the patient feels completely healthy. When symptoms finally emerge, they mimic a benign seasonal flu, low-grade fever, myalgia, severe muscle aches, particularly in the thighs, hips, and back, fatigue, and mild gastrointestinal upset. Because these symptoms are so nonspecific, most patients simply rest, hydrate, and wait it out. But around day 4 or 5, the clinical picture takes a sudden, catastrophic turn. The virus targets the endothelial cells lining the capillaries inside your lungs. It doesn't actually destroy these cells. Instead, it triggers an intense localized immune response. Your body floods the area with inflammatory cytokines, causing the tight junctions between your blood vessel cells to break apart. The capillaries literally begin to leak. Massive amounts of fluid pour directly out of your bloodstream and into the alveolar air sacs of your lungs. This is not typical pneumonia. This is non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. The patient is quite literally drowning in their own bodily fluids from the inside out. The speed of this progression is terrifying. A patient can go from mild breathlessness to severe acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, shock, and complete cardiovascular collapse within a matter of hours. This is exactly what we saw in the early cases of the MV Hondius cluster, where the disease rapidly progressed from fever to severe pneumonia and shock. Currently, the case fatality rate for hantavirus pulmonary syndrome stands at an alarming 38%. Nearly 2 out of every 5 patients who reach this stage do not survive. 2. Hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, HFRS. Now contrast this with the Old World presentation, primarily caused by the Hantan, Dobrava, or Pumala strains found throughout Europe and Asia. Instead of targeting the respiratory membrane, these strains home in on the vascular beds of the kidneys and the systemic circulatory system. HFRS manifests through 5 classic clinical phases. The febrile phase, abrupt onset of high fever, severe headache and intense lower back pain, renal angle tenderness. The hypotensive phase, blood pressure plummets as systemic capillaries leak, leading to physical shock. The oliguric phase, the kidneys begin to fail. Urine output drops to almost nothing, and toxic metabolic waste builds up in the blood. The diuretic phase, If the patient survives, the kidneys initiate a massive flush of fluid, producing liters of urine daily. The convalescent phase, a slow, months-long recovery of renal function. In its most severe forms, HFRS causes catastrophic internal bleeding, severe hemorrhage of the kidney tissue, and complete acute renal failure, while milder European strains like Pulmonary have a mortality rate of under 1%. The classic Asian Hantan strains carry a fatality rate of up to 15%. Historical precedents, the lesson of the Korean War. To truly understand the destructive power of HFRS, we have to look back to the Korean War, 1950-1953. During the conflict, over 3,000 United Nations soldiers stationed near the Hantan River suddenly fell ill with a mysterious, terrifying disease. They presented with high fevers, intense internal bleeding, and sudden kidney failure. Military doctors were baffled. At the time, they called it Korean hemorrhagic fever. Because the science of virology was not yet advanced enough to isolate the pathogen, soldiers were treated with basic supportive care, and many died. It wasn't until 1978, nearly 3 decades later, that South Korean virologist Dr. Ho Wang Lee finally isolated the virus from the lungs of a striped field mouse near the Hantan River, officially naming it the Hantan virus and establishing the Hantaviridae family. This historical lesson is critical. It proves that hantaviruses are not newly engineered pathogens. They are ancient, highly stable evolutionary survivalists. They do not mutate at the rapid, chaotic rate of RNA viruses like influenza or SARS-CoV-2. A strain isolated today is genetically almost identical to the strain that infected soldiers in the 1950s or indigenous populations centuries ago. This stability is a double-edged sword. It means the virus is highly unlikely to suddenly mutate into a highly contagious, easily transmissible airborne pandemic. But it also means that its high lethality, its ability to cause 40% mortality through rapid vascular leakage, remains a permanent, unyielding feature of its biology. To truly understand why the scientific community is watching the current outbreak on the MV Hondius with such intense scrutiny, we have to look back at the most detailed, clinically documented case study of human-to-human hantavirus transmission in history, the 2018 Epuyén outbreak. Epuyén is a picturesque, remote mountain village of roughly 2,000 residents nestled in Chubut province, deep in Argentine Patagonia. It is a place surrounded by temperate rainforests and the dramatic peaks of the Andes, the exact ecological habitat of the long-tailed pygmy rice rat, the primary reservoir for the Andes strain of hantavirus. On November 3, 2018, a 68-year-old local resident attended a birthday party in the village with about 100 other guests. He was feeling slightly off. A mild, low-grade fever was just beginning to set in, accompanied by some general muscle fatigue. Believing it was just a standard cold, he stayed at the celebration for about 90 minutes. During that time, he engaged in normal, close-quarters social interactions, including a brief, seconds-long exchange with another guest near the restroom. What followed over the next 2.5 months remains one of the most chilling chain reactions in modern epidemiological literature. That single 90-minute birthday party became a massive superspreader event. The 68-year-old man unwittingly passed the virus to multiple guests during his highly infectious pre-symptomatic prodromal phase. Those guests went home, incubated the virus for weeks, and then passed it to their own immediate family members, caregivers, and local healthcare workers. By the time the outbreak was officially declared over in late January 2019, health authorities had documented 34 laboratory-confirmed cases of Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome in Epuyén. Out of those 34 infected individuals, 11 people died. This event shattered several long-held dogmas in clinical virology. For decades, Western medicine treated hantaviruses as strictly zoonotic, dead-end infections. If you didn't inhale dust contaminated by rodent droppings, you were considered completely safe. The Epuyén outbreak proved, through rigorous genetic sequencing and contact tracing, that the Andes strain could bypass this rule entirely. Epidemiologists found near-identical viral RNA sequences in patients who had absolutely zero history of rodent exposure, confirming they had contracted it directly from other human beings. Even more concerning was how the virus traveled. A local healthcare worker who had cared for one of the confirmed patients in Epuyén traveled across the border into neighboring Chile. Unbeknownst to her, she was incubating the virus. When she entered her own contagious window, she began shedding the pathogen, carrying a deadly South American virus across an international border without a single rodent involved. When epidemiologists analyzed the transmission patterns in Epuyén, they identified 3 distinct superspreader events. All 3 shared 3 specific clinical hallmarks: enclosed, unventilated spaces, Transmission occurred indoors, where microscopic respiratory droplets could remain concentrated. Proximity and duration. It required close physical contact, typically within a family unit, a shared household, or a tight medical setting. The prodromal peak. Transmission almost always occurred when the source patient was in that narrow, early fever window, before severe respiratory distress set in. This is the exact reason why the MV Hondius cruise ship cluster is causing such concern today in May 2026. A cruise ship is, by definition, a highly controlled, enclosed environment with shared common spaces. If the Andes strain of Hantavirus is indeed spreading person to person among passengers on board, it mirrors the exact environmental dynamics of the Epuyén outbreak, but on an international maritime scale. Understanding this history shows us that we do not need to worry about a highly contagious measles-like pandemic. But it emphasizes that when a unique pathogen like the Andes virus is introduced to a closed environment, the threshold for transmission drops, and the clinical consequences can be devastating. If we are to prescribe a medication of pure, objective facts to counter the media's current hysteria, we must look directly at the crisis unfolding right now, in real time. On April 1, 2026, the Dutch-flagged cruise vessel MV Hondius departed Ushuaia, Argentina, carrying roughly 150 passengers and crew representing 28 nations. The ship's planned 33-day itinerary took it across the South Atlantic, stopping in some of the most remote, ecologically diverse environments on Earth: Antarctica, South Georgia, Tristan da Cunha, and St. Helena. By early May, this voyage of a lifetime had transformed into an international public health emergency. As of today, the outbreak has claimed 3 lives, with 6 laboratory-confirmed cases and multiple suspect cases hospitalized across South Africa, the Netherlands, Germany, St. Helena, Spain, and Switzerland. But as clinical investigators, we must ask the critical diagnostic question: how did a rodent-borne virus with a typical dead-end transmission route find its way onto a luxury vessel with 0 reported rodent activity on board? The epidemiological puzzle was solved when investigators identified Patient Zero. The genesis. Patient Zero's ecological exposure. Patient Zero was identified as Leo Schilperoord, a Dutch ornithologist who boarded the MV Hondius in Ushuaia on April 1st. Prior to boarding, he and his wife, Miriam, had spent over 4 months, from late November 2025 through March 2026, on an extensive off-the-grid road trip spanning Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina. As an avid birdwatcher, Leo frequented remote rural areas. Investigators confirmed that during his travels, he visited a local Argentine landfill, a prime habitat for foraging rodents, to spot a rare bird species. In doing so, he stepped directly into a high-concentration invisible exposure zone. He inhaled microscopic dust contaminated with the Andes strain of Hantavirus, the silent incubation and onboard spreading. Because the incubation period for Hantavirus is exceptionally long, stretching anywhere from 1 to 8 weeks, Leo felt completely healthy when he walked up the gangway of the MV Hondius. On April 6th, 5 days into the voyage, the virus completed its replication cycle. Leo developed a sudden fever, headache, and mild diarrhea. By April 11th, his lungs began to fail, and he tragically died on board. At the time, no microbiological testing could be performed. It was during Leo's early febrile phase, that highly infectious prodromal window, that the virus likely found its way to those in close, prolonged contact with him. His wife, Miriam, developed symptoms shortly after. A third passenger, a German national, contracted the virus and subsequently died on board on May 2nd. Even a British crew member serving as a ship guide and a Dutch nurse became infected, requiring urgent medical evacuation. Because the vessel is a confined space, the Andes strain broke its evolutionary boundaries. While casual, passing contact in a well-ventilated area carries almost no risk, the prolonged proximity of cabin living, shared dining, and close quarters care allowed limited human-to-human transmission to take place. The global containment effort. When the MV Hondius finally docked in Tenerife from Spain yesterday on May 10th, the Spanish government initiated a highly controlled military-grade evacuation protocol. The ship was anchored out to sea, and passengers were carefully transported to a cordoned-off, completely isolated area at the airport to be repatriated via charter flights back to their home countries. Meanwhile, health agencies worldwide, including the UK Health Security Agency, UKHSA, and the US CDC, which classified this as a Level 3 emergency response, are aggressively contact tracing, They are monitoring 29 passengers who disembarked early on St. Helena on April 24th, as well as passengers who shared a subsequent flight to Johannesburg with Leo's widow, Miriam, before she tragically passed away in a South African emergency department. The UKHSA has established a strict 42-day active monitoring protocol for all potentially exposed individuals. Because of the silent, multi-week incubation window, we are not out of the woods yet. This is the clinical reality of the MV Hondius outbreak. It is not the beginning of a rapid airborne COVID-style pandemic, but for those caught in its localized web, it represents an aggressive, highly lethal clinical emergency that demands our absolute respect and precise understanding. When evaluating the clinical timeline of a patient infected with the Andes strain of Hantavirus, we are looking at a highly structured, insidious biological progression. Because this virus is a New World strain, it primarily manifests as Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS. To help my patients and fellow clinicians conceptualize this disease, I break down the clinical course of HPS into 3 distinct, non-negotiable phases. Phase 1, the incubation period, the silent replicator. This is the period between the physical inhalation of the viral particles and the onset of the very first symptom. With hantavirus, this window is extraordinarily wide. The clinical window typically ranges from 1 to 8 weeks with a median of approximately 18 days. The biology. During this time, the virus is quietly entering the host's endothelial cells, the cells lining the blood vessels, slowly replicating without triggering a massive systemic immune response. The patient feels completely healthy. They go to work, exercise, and socialize, entirely unaware of the biological clock ticking inside them. We saw this exact dynamic play out with the passengers on the MV Hondius. Many who boarded the vessel on April 1st had been exposed weeks prior during land excursions in South America, but they walked up the gangway feeling in peak physical condition. Phase 2, the prodromal phase, the great imitator. Once the incubation period ends, the virus begins to spill into the bloodstream, triggering the body's innate immune system. This phase lasts between 3 and 5 days, presenting with symptoms that are frustratingly mundane. A sudden low-grade fever, intense myalgia, deep muscle aches, particularly concentrated in the large muscle groups of the thighs, hips, and lower back. Progressive fatigue, headaches, and chills. Gastrointestinal distress, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. Because these symptoms are identical to a standard winter influenza or food poisoning, almost no one seeks emergency medical care at this stage. However, in the case of the Andes virus, this is the most critical window for epidemiologists because this is when the patient is highly infectious to close contacts. The virus is present in their saliva and respiratory secretions. Phase 3, the cardiopulmonary phase, the vascular collapse. This is the tipping point where the disease shifts from a standard flu-like illness to a life-threatening medical emergency. It occurs with terrifying speed, often over a span of just a few hours. The trigger. As the patient's immune system mounts a massive dysregulated response, a cytokine storm, the capillary walls inside the lungs lose their structural integrity. They become highly permeable, essentially turning into a sieve. The symptoms. The primary symptom is a sudden, dry cough, followed by progressive, rapidly worsening shortness of breath, dyspnea. The patient feels a crushing tightness in their chest, describing it as trying to breathe through a wet sponge. The progression. Within hours, the lungs fill with fluid. As oxygen levels in the blood plummet, the heart struggles to pump. The patient's blood pressure collapses, leading to myocardial depression, severe shock, and multi-organ failure. Historical precedent. The 1918 influenza pandemic. To put this rapid immune-mediated destruction into perspective, we must look at the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. The most terrifying feature of that pandemic was not that the virus itself killed the host, but rather how it turned the host's own immune system against them. Healthy young adults with robust immune systems died within 24 hours of their first symptoms because their bodies mounted an overactivated immune response, filling their lungs with fluid and causing them to suffocate. This is the exact same pathophysiological mechanism we observe in HPS. The high mortality rate, nearly 38%, is driven largely by the host's own immune system going into overdrive. This is why the virus is so lethal to young, healthy individuals who otherwise have no pre-existing conditions. If you ever find yourself presenting with a sudden fever and progressive shortness of breath within 8 weeks of a potential rodent exposure, you must bypass the local clinic and go straight to an emergency department. Time is the only currency that matters during the cardiopulmonary phase. In the landscape of modern medicine, we are accustomed to a standard pharmaceutical playbook. If you have a bacterial infection, we prescribe targeted antibiotics. If you have influenza, we administer neuraminidase inhibitors like oseltamivir. If you have COVID-19, we utilize direct-acting antivirals. However, when a patient presents with Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS, that traditional playbook is completely empty. There is currently no approved antiviral drug, no targeted therapeutic, and no widely available vaccine for hantavirus infection. This brings us to our third medication of knowledge. Understanding that clinical management relies entirely on early detection, aggressive supportive care, and highly specialized intensive care unit, ICU, interventions. The limits of antiviral therapy. Historically, researchers have turned to ribavirin, a broad-spectrum nucleoside analog used to treat certain viral hemorrhagic fevers. In clinical trials, ribavirin has shown some efficacy in reducing the severity and mortality of hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, HFRS, the kidney-targeting old-world presentation of hantavirus. However, when evaluated in patients with hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS, caused by New World strains like sin nombre or Andes, ribavirin failed to demonstrate any significant clinical benefit once the patient entered the cardiopulmonary phase. This is because the physical damage in HPS is not primarily driven by active viral replication, but rather by the host's own hyperactivated immune response. By the time the patient develops severe respiratory symptoms, the biological cascade of vascular leakage has already been initiated. The ICU suite, supportive interventions. Because we cannot directly kill the virus, our clinical objective is simple, yet incredibly demanding. We must keep the patient's body oxygenated and hemodynamically stable, keeping them alive long enough for their own immune system to clear the pathogen. This clinical support operates on a delicate spectrum. 1. Careful fluid management. In a standard shock scenario, a clinical team's instinct is to aggressively administer intravenous fluids to raise a collapsing blood pressure. In HPS, this is a fatal error. Because the capillaries in the lungs are highly permeable, any excess fluid introduced into the bloodstream will leak directly into the lungs, worsening the pulmonary edema and accelerating suffocation. We must monitor hemodynamic parameters with extreme precision, balancing fluid restriction with vasopressors to maintain blood pressure without overloading the lungs. 2. Advanced ventilatory support. As the lungs fill with fluid, standard oxygen masks quickly become insufficient. Patients must be transitioned rapidly to mechanical ventilation. This requires protective lung ventilation strategies, using low tidal volumes and high positive end expiratory pressure, PEEP, to keep the fluid-filled alveoli open without causing physical trauma, barotrauma, to the fragile, inflamed lung tissue. 3. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, ECMO. When mechanical ventilation is no longer enough to maintain life-sustaining oxygen levels, we must turn to the ultimate tool in advanced life support, ECMO. An ECMO machine acts as an artificial heart and lung outside the body. It drains the patient's blood, removes carbon dioxide, infuses it with oxygen, and pumps it back into the circulatory system. This completely bypasses the patient's failing lungs, giving the delicate pulmonary tissue time to rest and heal. Clinical data has shown that when ECMO is initiated early in severe HPS cases, survival rates can jump from a grim 38% to upwards of 80%. The science of vaccine development. The absolute lack of a universally approved vaccine for the Andes or sin nombre strains remains an open challenge in public health. While South Korea and China utilize localized vaccines, such as Hantavax, targeting the Hantan and Seoul strains with moderate efficacy, these do not provide cross-protection against the highly lethal South American Andes strain. Researchers are currently evaluating DNA vaccines and recombinant protein platforms in early-stage clinical trials. However, because hantavirus outbreaks are historically sporadic and geographically isolated, funding and large-scale Phase 3 clinical trials are incredibly difficult to execute. This clinical reality is exactly what is driving the coordinated global response to the MV Hondius outbreak today. Public health bodies like the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC, and the CDC have deployed specialized teams because they recognize that without direct medical cures, the only way to save lives is through early identification, immediate quarantine of high-risk contacts, and rapid transit to specialized biocontainment units equipped with ECMO capabilities. Once again, the ultimate medical defense is not a pill or an injection. It is immediate clinical awareness. As we conclude this clinical briefing, we must translate these scientific dimensions into a concrete, actionable protocol. The outbreak on the MV Hondius is a stark, real-time reminder that our modern world remains permanently connected to ancient, unpredictable pathogens. If you belong to a high-exposure category, whether you work in agriculture, construction, rural land management, or simply have an unventilated storage space, cabin, or garage that has remained sealed for months, you must adopt the Sentinel's protocol. The three-step biodefense protocol. Step 1. Environmental assessment. Never walk into a suspected rodent-infested area and begin dry sweeping or vacuuming. This instantly aerosolizes the dried viral particles, creating a localized, invisible exposure zone. Step 2. Wet remediation. Non-negotiable sequence. Before cleaning, open all doors and windows to ventilate the space for at least 30 minutes. Don an N95-rated respirator mask. Saturate all droppings, nests, and surfaces with a disinfectant solution of 1 part household bleach to 10 parts water. Let it sit for 10 minutes to completely deactivate the viral envelope before wiping. Step 3. Clinical vigilance. If you develop a sudden fever, severe muscle aches, and progressive breathlessness within 1 to 8 weeks of cleaning a sealed space or traveling to an endemic area, bypass the local clinic. Go straight to an emergency department. Tell the triage physician immediately, "I have had potential contact with rodent-contaminated materials." That single sentence completely changes the diagnostic pathway and can save your life. Final thoughts from Dr. Liam Cooper. In my over 2 decades of clinical experience, the most critical lesson I have learned is that knowledge is the ultimate vaccine against panic. When we look at history, from the UN soldiers on the Hantavirus River to the citizens of Epuyén and now the passengers of the MV Hondius, we see that pathogens do not respect our convenience, but they do respect rigorous, rational science. I want to hear from you directly. Do you have an enclosed space in your life, a garage, a shed, or a cabin that you need to clean out soon? Has today's briefing changed how you plan to approach it? Let me know in the comments below. Clinical disclaimer. The information provided in this video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health providers with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. If this briefing provided you with objective clinical clarity instead of sensationalized fear, please hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs context over chaos. Take care of your health, stay rational, and I will see you in the next video.